Hello, my name is Brian Smith. I research the Darwinian evolution of business models and competitive strategies in areas like pharma, medtech, and other biomedical industries. Today's masterclass is the fifth in a series of 8. These masterclasses are designed for strategists in pharma, medtech, and related industries. They're about strategy, not tactics. So if that's what you'd like to talk about, then please contact me offline and I'll be glad to talk to you about that. All of my masterclass presentations can be found on my YouTube channel, so please take a look at the others and share them with your colleagues. There are also supporting articles for many of the masterclasses, so if you'd like PDFs of those, then please just get in touch. My masterclasses are based on my book Brand Therapy, which is a manual for making strong strategies in biomedical markets. Brand Therapy and my 6 other books are all about the biomedical industry, and they're all available on Amazon and everywhere else, in fact. So the material I cover today is mostly based on academic research, but also on the hands-on work that I do when I'm applying this stuff with pharma and medtech companies in the real world. So these are the questions that I'm going to try to answer today. My aim is to challenge your thinking and to help you become better at segmentation in your marketplace. What I'm going to say is that most of what you call segmentation is probably not in fact segmentation. I'm going to say that there's a better way of doing what you're doing now, and I'm going to say that doing segmentation better makes your marketing strategy much better. So let's look at that first question on why segmentation. In most markets, your customers have a choice. Even when your product is new and unique and you're a new product category, they can choose to stay with the old product or the old way of doing things, or to do something completely different. But it's very rare for market share to be split evenly between all of the competitors and alternatives. Most markets come to be dominated by a small number of successful competitors. This is obviously very important from a commercial point of view. So researchers have asked what causes customer preference to go towards one competitor rather than another. And this research, decades of research, has been done in lots of businesses. And although the detailed answer is always different in every case, of course, it turns out that the answer is one single high-level answer that turns out to be true in all cases. The thing is, of course, that customers prefer you when you meet their needs better than the alternatives could meet their needs. Of course, what customers need and want is complex and multidimensional. In our market, their needs are clinical, economic, educational, to do with confidence and self-actualization, and many other dimensions. And what we offer, what pharma and medtech companies offer, is our value proposition, which is also complex. It involves the product, but also evidence and service and support and relationships and pricing and many, many other things. But the basic fact is that what marketing strategists are trying to do is to create customer preference by meeting their customers' needs better than the alternatives do. This is just marketing 101. It's obvious and it's clear, and it's what all marketing strategies are about. But this fundamental truth has a problem, of course. And that problem is market heterogeneity. Different customers have different needs and wants. They're not all clones of each other. So if you offer a single value proposition to the market, some customers will prefer you, others will be indifferent to you, and others will prefer the alternatives. So in most markets, offering one value proposition to the market doesn't work very well because the market is heterogeneous. So the answer to our first question is this. We segment in order to achieve customer preference in heterogeneous markets. We are very familiar with this idea in consumer markets like cars or washing detergents, but exactly the same is true in biomedical markets, because even when patients have exactly the same clinical status, they vary in things like attitude or adherence or comorbidities and so on. And even two professionals doing exactly the same job might vary in how innovative they get or how skeptical they are about new technology. And even two peers doing exactly the same job might have different attitudes towards value or be in different economic situations. So unless you work in a market where all the customers are clones on each other and they have no alternatives, then you need to think about segmentation. So almost all biomedical companies do or should do segmentation because their markets are heterogeneous and they have competitors. And I've spent a lot of time studying what they do in practice, trying to answer this second question, and especially trying to understand what works and what doesn't work. When I ask a pharma or medtech or other biomedical company to tell me how they segment their market, this is the sort of thing that I hear. There are many different approaches, but all of these describe some aspect of the patient or the professional or the account. And these segmentation methods have the advantage of being easy to use and relevant. If you sell wound dressings, it's easy to find and target tissue viability nurses, and they are relevant to customer preference. If you're talking to an oncologist, it's simple to communicate that a treatment is second line for the indication. If I'm briefing an agency, it's easy to tell them to target innovative prescribers who currently use the leading brand. These sorts of examples and variations on them represent 90% of what I see when I study market segmentation in pharma, medtech, and biomedical markets. You may be using something exactly like this, but all of these methods and their variations that I see all the time, they all have a major problem. The problem is that they're not really segments, because the purpose of a segment is to allow that alignment process between what is offered and what is wanted. A genuine segment must meet two criteria. First, all members of the segment must want pretty much the same thing, and therefore they must respond similarly to any given value proposition. If the members of the segment have different needs and different wants and they vary, then their preference for your offer will vary, and you're not really segmenting. Secondly, members of each segment must have significantly different needs from other segments and therefore respond differently to the other segments when offered a given value proposition. If the needs of two or more segments are not different and distinct, then you're not really talking different segments, they're the same segment, and they need the same value proposition too. It's these two factors, homogeneous and distinct, that cause a problem with the segmentation caused by most pharma, medtech, and biomedical companies, because most of the segments used by those sorts of companies are not homogeneous and they're not distinct. They are not real segments. There are two issues, two bits of theory that underlie this. The first issue is that all of these segments are based on descriptive terms like behavior or product usage or disease state. But what we really care about are the motivating needs and wants of the customers, the needs and wants that shape their customer preference. We use descriptors, which are easy to measure, as proxies for needs and wants, which are hard to measure. Sometimes these descriptors are good proxies for motivating needs, but often they're not. For example, you might group all teaching hospital hemo-oncologists into one segment, but they may vary hugely in their willingness to change or their attitudes to immuno-oncology. Or we might call all GINA category 4 asthma patients one segment, but we might find that they all differ greatly in their degree of adherence or their causes of their asthma or their social situation. So problem one is that segmentation is about grouping customers according to their motivating needs, but we tend to group them into easy categories, and those easy descriptor categories are often not homogeneous and distinct. Problem two is a problem that especially impacts in biomedical markets. You see, the theory of segmentation was developed in consumer markets in which an individual makes a choice. So an individual decide what car they want, what brand of detergent they need, what chocolate bar they want to buy. And 20 years ago, this was an okay approximation of biomedical markets because medicines and devices were typically chosen by a professional, by a doctor, by a nurse, by a lab scientist, by a pharmacist. But we don't live in that world any longer. Customer preference is driven by the needs and wants of multiple stakeholders. For medicine, for example, it's typically a combination of payer, patient, and prescriber's motivations. In other markets, the decision might include two sets of professionals, such as a pathologist and a pathologist's internal customers. The point is that we can't segment the patients or the payers or the prescribers alone. Even an homogeneous and distinct patient segment will not act homogeneously to a single value proposition because different patients may be under different professional or in different payer contexts. And an homogeneous and distinct professional segment will not act homogeneously to a single value proposition because different professionals may be in different payer and patient contexts. And an homogeneous and distinct payer segment will not act homogeneously to a single value proposition because different payers may be in different patient and professional contexts. We have to understand the heterogeneity of the decision-making context, which can be a combination of any sorts of stakeholder segments. In other words, it's the segment, it's the context that you're segmenting, not just the individual stakeholders. The point is that if you segment only one of the stakeholders, then you still might have a segment that is not homogeneous and distinct. So for instance, you might segment all young, active hip replacement patients, but some of those will be under very progressive orthopedic surgeons and others very conservative consultants. And each context would have different needs and wants. Or you might segment all the surgeons with an interest in bariatric surgery, but some of them will be with payers that think it's good value and some where the payers think it's not. Again, each would need a different context. Each different context would need a different value proposition. In short, biomedical markets, we have to understand the heterogeneity of the decision-making context in which can be any combination of the stakeholder segments. In other words, if our value proposition is going to create customer preference, it must align to the combination of stakeholders' needs, not just the patient or the prescriber or the payer. So this sort of traditional biomedical segmentation doesn't really work very well, either because our easily measurable descriptor labels like job titles or disease states are poor proxies for needs and wants, or because customer preference is driven by context and not just by one stakeholder. In short, our industry's typical segmentation approaches are not really segmentation, they're categorizations. They're not really true homogeneous and distinct segmentation. We do it this way, and most companies do, not because it works, not because it's effective, but because it was the way that we did it in the 1980s. It's a hangover from the past. So let me summarize where we've got to. Segmentation is really important to create customer preference. But what most biomedical marketing companies do is not really segmentation, it's categorization, which is much, much less effective. Categorization is an outdated practice. So this leads to the third question of, well, what can we do? Well, at this point, let me make clear what I'm not going to cover in this masterclass, what I don't have time to cover. The implementation of segmentation is in two parts. One is using the data, both quantitative and qualitative, to create insight. And the other is using that insight to understand the segmentation. It's comparable to preparing the ingredients for food and then cooking them. In this masterclass, I'm going to cover the cooking part, but I'm not going to cover the preparation part. That's because the preparation is very situation specific and it depends on the company and the markets and so on. But if you want to know more about how that's done, there's 80,000 words about how that's done in this book, Creating Market Insight, which I recommend to you. And of course, I'm happy to talk to you about it offline if you want me to. So let's concentrate on how to turn insight into an effective segmentation. I'm going to show an example where it is these three stakeholders, but I'll remind you that any specific case is specific. If this example doesn't reflect your market, then don't throw away the concepts or the ideas. Just think how they can be adapted to your situation. So this example is the market for anticoagulants, and we begin with patient segmentation. In this example, we managed to find insight that what was motivating the customers were the different patient needs were varied in two ways. They were the degree of coagulation control they needed, so-called CHADS risk in that market, and the desire of the patients to be active. And by using this insight, we were able to identify 4 different patient segments. Similarly, when we looked at the prescribers of anticoagulants, we discovered 2 major variances. Their emotive need to feel proactive and engaged when managing the risk of clotting, and they need to feel they were considering the patient holistically as a whole person, not just a condition. This again led to us identifying 4 different prescriber segments. And finally, when we looked at the payers in this area, we found that they varied along 2 behavioural dimensions. One was how much they like to work with prescribers rather than dictate to them, and the other was their view of value, whether it was a narrow view of value as price or a broad view of value as overall value. That allowed us to identify 4 payer segments. Now, in theory, any type of patient can be under any type of prescriber, and any type of prescriber can be with any kind of payer. So that means that in theory, there are 64 possible contextual segments, 4 times 4 times 4. Every prescribing decision fits into one or other of these segments, into these cute little coloured cubes. And each of these cubes is pretty much homogeneous and distinct. That is, they're real segments, they're not categories. Now, in theory, what you should do then is align to each cube perfectly with 64 variations of your value proposition. But of course, whilst it's important to understand that theoretical background, in practice, it's very difficult to target 64 different segments. Consumer companies may do that, supermarkets may do that, but they have different data sources from us. And in practice, these cubes are not all the same size because their motivating needs are not distributed evenly. Some are so small that they don't exist for practical purposes. Some are so close to each other in behaviours that they're not really very distinct. And some contexts will be very hard to win because our product just doesn't meet their needs. So, and some might be so short-lived that they're not, or so small that they're just not financially viable. So what we do in practice is that we take the 64 theoretical contextual segments and we apply some filters, so some 4 tests of practical segmentation. We rule out segments that can't be reached. In this case, for instance, those that are very committed to very cheap generic warfarin. We rule out segments that we can reach but aren't worth considering. And in practice, we relax a little the homogeneous and distinct rules to combine some segments where it's practically possible. In practice, I usually find that once you've gone past the theory, there are between 4 and 10 functional segments in most biomedical markets. And in this particular example, it was operationalized into 4 simple segment strategy. So it identified the segment where you would enter the market, the segment that you would develop for tomorrow and build your market, another segment where you would only apply maintenance resources and not waste resources, and in this case about 40% of the market where any effort would result in low return on investment, and from which effort could be diverted into more important segments. Remember, of course, that your strategic goal is not to maximize market share. Your strategic goal is to maximize a risk-adjusted return on investment. And that usually means aiming to dominate these segments with high return on investment and pulling resources away from those segments with low return on investment. So there's the answer to your third question. Your segment biomedical markets by a method known as contextual segmentation. In principle, it's straightforward, but like any valuable skill in practice, it's harder and it requires skill and effort. But I've done this hundreds of times with pharma, medtech, and IVD companies, and they find it both practically useful, but also a great way to get the team to coalesce around the strategy. But this allows me to go on to the fourth question of what you should use the results of your segmentation for. The results of your segmentation analysis are usually used in two ways. The first is that the outputs of the process, those 4 to 10 homogeneous, distinct, accessible, viable segments I talked about, become the input into another process called the focus matrix. The focus matrix assesses the relative attractiveness of each segment and how winnable it is by your company. And the output of the focus matrix is a series of recommendations about what sort of resources you should focus and where you should focus them. And that allows you to define your marketing strategy using a method known as Drucker's definition. Drucker's definition gives you a very actionable and strong marketing strategy. We don't have the time in this masterclass to cover these details, but if you want to know more, then by all means either read the book or contact me for a discussion. The second use of the outputs of your contextual segmentation process is that it identifies opportunities and threats that come from market heterogeneity. These go through a validation process called the reality filters, and the validated opportunities and validated threats become one of the inputs into the SWOT alignment. Again, there isn't time in this masterclass to cover this, but we will cover it in the SWOT alignment masterclass. So there's the answer to your fourth question. Your segmentation analysis provides input into two other parts of your strategic marketing planning process: the SWOT analysis and the focus matrix, which then leads into the Drucker's definition of your marketing strategy. In practice, you can't really make strong strategy unless you do segmentation effectively. So let me now move on to the final question about the sorts of opportunities and threats that segmentation typically leads to. This is obviously case specific. The answers for your company will be different from those for another company. But one of the advantages of effective segmentation is that it illuminates both threats and opportunities. So, for example, an easy to attack large segment is an opportunity. It also identifies large resource consuming segments where you have little chance to win, and those are threats because they threaten your return on investment. But you can also identify opportunities, for example, from synergies where segments influence each other. Or you can identify threats when you see segments where focusing on one will make it harder to focus on another. The lesson I want you to take is that contextual segmentation is a very important part, a critical part of the marketing strategy making process, because it identifies opportunities and threats that arise from the simple fact that your customers are not all the same. And if you aren't doing segmentation, then you stand very little chance of making a strong marketing strategy. All strong strategies, in my experience, are based on strong segmentation. Almost all weak strategies begin with weak segmentation. So there's the answer to your final question. Contextual segmentation is a process that is an essential input into targeting, SWOT alignment, and value proposition design. Segmentation is the foundation that every other part of your marketing strategy is built on. And if you're not doing it effectively, then you will be outcompeted by your rivals who are. So I'm going to close now by issuing a challenge to you. There are 7 major differences between best practice and typical practice in segmentation. And I challenge you to think about where you are and where your firm is on this spectrum. So first of all, do you segment at all, or do you target the whole market? Second, do you segment the context or just the individual stakeholders? Do you segment their motivating needs, or do you just use simple descriptor categories? Do you synthesize multiple sources of data to make your own insight, or do you just buy the same data that your competitors do? Do you use HTAV to validate your segments, or do you just assume that they're strong? Do you look for a wider range of opportunities and threats that come from segmentation, or do you just use it for targeting? And finally, do you integrate your segmentation with other tools like value proposition design and the focus grid and SWOT alignment, or do you use it simply as a standalone method? So here's my challenge to you. If you and your company are more to the left than to the right, then there's the opportunity for you and your marketing colleagues to add value to your company by better segmentation. It's probably the most important single thing you can do to improve your marketing strategy. So that's as much as I want to say today. If you'd like to know more about how to apply these ideas to your company, then please contact me directly. If you enjoyed the masterclass, then please mention it and share it with your friends on LinkedIn and Twitter. And most of all, you might want to look at the other books I've written about strategy and the evolution of the industry. I hope you'll watch some of my other masterclasses and recommend them to your colleagues. And if you'd like to get in touch with me about my work, then please do so. My details are on the screen now, and I'd be delighted to hear from you. Thank you very much for listening to me.